everyone, and welcome back to my booktube channel, Lisa in Bookland. Today I'm here to bring you the book postscript tag that was originally created by Memento Mori in 2018, whose original video I'll link down below. So I'm a bit late in the party to this tag. It is March, but I wasn't on booktube at the start of this year or last year. I wasn't tagged by anyone, but I thought the questions in this tag looked really interesting, and I thought it would be a great excuse to revisit some of the great books that I read last year and tell you about them. So the first question is the longest book you've read this year and the book it took you longest to finish. So first up, the longest book I read this year was actually a reread. I think it's about my second or third reread of this, and it's Bleak House by Charles Dickens. This book was published in 1852 and 1853 in serial form, and it follows a whole cast of characters. It centres really about this court case called Jarndyce and Jarndyce, which has been going on forever, and it's about this disputed will, and two of the young characters in this book, Ada and Richard, are kind of embroiled in that case and they're wards of the court, and Esther Summerson then is kind of the third main character, who is Ada's companion, and it follows them as they go to Bleak House, the house of the title, to stay with Mr. Jarndyce, who's to be Ada and Richard's guardian. It's a really great book. I'd highly recommend if you're up for a bit of a chunky classic, but I think it's a really easy one to get into, and I love the characters in this book. So even though this is the longest book I read, it wasn't the book that it took me the longest to read. I don't use Goodreads, I just keep track on just this paper diary, so I'm not really sure what book it took me the longest to read. I have a feeling it might be this non-fiction book, which is quite a large one, quite specialised. So Nelson's Navy, the Ship's Men, an organisation 1793 to 1815. Basically, if you've watched any of my other videos on this channel, you'll know that I love nautical fiction and nautical history in general. I've just been interested in ships, but I wanted to know a little bit more of the fact about them. Sorry, this book is very shiny and I'm filming at night as usual, but I wanted to know a bit more of the technical detail and have some pictures to put with the words, I suppose, and I saw this book recommended, so I picked it up, read it in little chunks, maybe a chapter every weekend for a good few months. There's loads of pictures in it really that could just show you everything you wanted to know about the Navy in this period. There's a little bit in like foreign navies in the back, and yeah, it was great. It wasn't very easy to get my hands on. I did have to pay a few euros for it to get it online, but it was worth it in my opinion, and it's one I'll be coming back to in sections. So the next question is a book you read that was outside of your comfort zone. So I had a look back, and I'd say the truth is that 2021 wasn't really a year for reading outside my comfort zone. I do think I will do a little bit better this year, especially I think being involved in booktube does kind of push you to try new things and try new authors from different countries and that, so I will try to do better this year. But yeah, I kind of dove headfirst into Georgian era Britain. I read a lot of that kind of area. So the one book that did stick out to me that was outside my comfort zone, and I kind of maybe nearly knew I wouldn't like it before I went into it, but I still gave it a go, was the Magus by John Fowles that I have mentioned on this channel before, I think. Very highly commended book, just not for me. It's a literary postmodern. It was described as metafiction. I don't even know what metafiction is, I'm sorry, but yeah, it's set on this Greek island and all the characters are, you know, kind of manipulating each other. Yeah, I wouldn't say it was a particularly successful jaunt outside my comfort zone. Question 3 is how many books did you reread? So to be honest, I didn't reread that many books in 2021. I only reread 12 books, so that's 9%, which is quite low for me. I looked back in 2020 just out of interest, and in that year 25% of my books were rereads, which I suppose might be in line with what was happening in 2020 when things were a lot more fresh and shocking, and obviously I was just going back to familiar reads for comfort. So like 25% is a bit high, so somewhere in between 9 and 25% would be more normal for me. So the next question is, what was your favourite reread? So I'd say my favourite reread of 2021 was definitely Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. I'd read this once before and I did enjoy it, but going in the second time I knew more what to expect with the writing style, with the length of the book and kind of how much it would cover, and I knew a little bit more about Tudor history as well, which helped. For anybody that doesn't know, Wolf Hall follows this guy called Thomas Cromwell, who is a real character in history, and in this book he kind of starts off very like lowborn, and it shows how he improves himself and ends up becoming one of Henry VIII's courtiers at the time of the Reformation and when Anne Boleyn was just coming to power. As well as the story in the court, it also kind of follows his family and him as a character, and you do really root for him. I understand he's not really that likeable of a character in history, but Hilary Mantel really gets inside his head in this book, which was really great. The first time I reread this book, I didn't read the other two books and they'd been sitting on my shelf for ages. This reread I did. Just remember reading the third one, The Mirror and the Light, when I had some time off work, and I enjoyed that so much. I just happened to see that the Royal Shakespeare Company were doing an adaptation of The Mirror and the Light in London. I'd be looking for an excuse anyways when things had started opening up a little bit, so I went over to London and saw the adaptation on the closing night, and the people beside me must have thought I was demented at the end because I was applauding so loudly. It was absolutely brilliant, and I'm only sorry that I didn't see the other two adaptations. So this is a special reread because I got a lot more out of the book the second time. It also led to that great experience of seeing The Mirror and the Light live on stage. So the next question is a book you read for the first time but are looking forward to rereading. So the answer to this has to be my favourite book of the year and my new favourite book of all time, or at least that's what I'm saying now, and that is The Kingdoms by Natasha Pulley. So I've mentioned again this book a few times. It's almost impossible to say anything about this book without giving spoilers, and that's part of the pleasure of this book. You kind of start off and you're like, what in the world is going on? But it's such an incredible reading experience. So like, as much as I can say really is at the start of the book, this man gets off a train, I think it's 1901, and he has severe amnesia. I can't really remember anything about himself. And later he receives a postcard with a picture of a lighthouse in Scotland, and the postcard says, "Come home if you remember." And not only that, this book is set in kind of an alternate history where France won the Napoleonic Wars and England is now a French colony, so that's obviously a fascinating background. And not only that, but the postcard he receives appears to have been sent 100 years ago, so how can that be possible? It's a fantastic, fantastic book. So I think it'll be incredibly rereadable. Number one, because it's obviously my favourite book. The plot was so complex. I know when you reread it you'll kind of spot something different or like foreshadowing every time, and that'll be a great experience. And the characters in this book, one character in particular is kind of the most enigmatic character I've ever read. You know, there was so much going on in this book, but a lot of the book I spent out just trying to figure out them, like to figure out what was going on. And then finally it's just jam-packed with things I love to read about, like the Napoleonic Wars sold me on its own, but everything else going on as well is just wonderful. So it's like this book was so good. I read it really slowly, and it took me a long time to read. I mean it, you know, I read the words really slowly because I just wanted to savour them so much in. I could barely bear it. It was just so good, and I've never had that intense a reaction to a book before. It was completely new to me. For the first 2 months after I read it, I thought about it every day, and I still think about it very regularly, and I'm just trying to hold off rereading it too soon, because I wanted to, you know, have a good space of time, like maybe a long weekend or something, to just really enjoy it. And I'd like to do a full review as well, with like spoilery thoughts on it. I would highly recommend it. Just go and read this book. So the next question is your favourite short story or novella. So rather shockingly, I only read one book that would be considered to fall into this category in 2021. Luckily it was absolutely wonderful, and it's called Allegiance by Heather Dahman, which I added to my Goodreads TBR years and years ago, and I finally read it. So it's available completely free online, which is very generous of the author. It's set in 1921 Dublin, so just after the Anglo-Irish Treaty has been signed, this MI5 agent called William gets sent over to Dublin to infiltrate this IRA group to find out if they're planning any kind of, disruptive activity to the very fragile new Irish Free State. So the author isn't Irish, but I thought she captured like old Dublin very well, like as far as I can know about old Dublin, not being from Dublin or not having lived in the 1920s. But I thought she did it really well, and also the history, she seemed to really have a good grasp on it. But the writing was good, the characters were believable, but the best part undoubtedly was the romance between the two characters. William has romance with this other man he meets in Dublin. It's just my kind of romance, slow building, believable, genuine but not soppy, if you know what I mean. So I would highly recommend this short little book. I leave both the Goodreads link but also the direct link to get the ebook below. So the next question is a book mass appeal you liked and would recommend to a wide variety of readers. So to be honest, I had a bit of difficulty with this question. I read a lot of kind of more niche or specialised books last year that probably wouldn't appeal to everybody. I read a lot of historical fiction anyways. Does that have mass appeal? Not everybody likes history. Some people kind of think of history in school when they think of historical fiction, so maybe not. I considered Red, White and Royal Blue, which is a very fun book which I really liked, but maybe not everybody would be up for the romance. They might think it was a bit too fluffy. So in the end, the best I could come up with to answer this question, which isn't to say that it's not a wonderful book, because it absolutely is the Outcasts of Time by Ian Mortimer. This book is historical fiction in a way, but it's kind of fantasy as well. So the idea of the book is these two brothers in the 1300s, they're dying of the Black Death, and they get the option to either live out their 6 remaining days in their own time, or else they can live out their 6 remaining days but travel forward 99 years each day. So they chose the latter, to be honest, so would I. So that's obviously a fascinating hook for the story. Even though this book is kind of historical fiction, because it's moving forward all the time, you don't spend too long in any one period. So there's loads of historical details, but you don't need to worry about them too much because the characters don't know what's going on anyways. So it's a very funny book because obviously every 99 years they travel forward, a lot of things have changed and they're just trying to get to grips with it all. The two brothers themselves are just wonderful characters, and how they deal differently with the situation and their relationship with each other. To be honest, I didn't actually pay too much attention to the historical details because I was just so interested in the plot, and so I think that would make it easier for people to access. Yeah, I think I'd be comfortable to recommend this to most people, at least for a try. So question 8 is the opposite then, really. So this is a book with specialised appeal, a book you liked but would be hesitant to recommend to just anyone. So for this one I'm going to go with The Terror by Dan Simmons. This book is a fictionalised account of the Franklin expedition to the Northwest Passage in the 1840s up in the Arctic, with some horror elements added, and this is such a gripping read. It had me up so late at night, curled up in blankets on the couch, afraid to go to bed in case something would get me if I put my feet outside the blankets. Yeah, some people might have seen the television series, but the book is really so much more terrifying. That's one of the reasons I hesitate to recommend it to anyone, because it's classified as horror. Personally, I don't read horror. I think the only other book I could technically call horror that I've read was The Shining, but personally I found this much scarier than The Shining, and that's because of the realistic elements towards the second half of the book. If you know the history of this expedition, I honestly can't make up my mind whether it makes this a better read if you know the history of the expedition or if you don't. There's kind of arguments for both sides. So as well as the horror, for obvious reasons there aren't any female characters in most of this book, which might put some people off, but rest assured the characters that are there are so wonderful and you really are so invested in them all throughout the whole book, which is painful given that it's a horror book. I would highly recommend this book if any of that sounds remotely interesting to you. It was one of my top reads of the year, despite that I read it so early in January in 2021, and it kicked off an interest in Arctic exploration to add to my list of strange and obscure topics that I'm interested in. But yeah, that's The Terror by Dan Simmons. Great book. So the last two questions in this tag aren't applicable to me because I wasn't creating content last year. I'm just lurking and commenting and generally dawdling and wondering if I would or wouldn't start a channel, and it's a bit late in the year to tag anyone else to do this. If you do feel like doing it, or if you're like me and you're a new booktuber and want to talk about books you've read last year, feel free to tag yourself. Go ahead. Thanks very much for listening, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next Thursday for another video.